Commerce, Justice, Science, Appropriations Subcommittee will come to order. We are here today to receive testimony from the Census Bureau and the Government Accountability Office in preparation for the 2020 census. One of the things that the Constitution requires us to do, we want to make sure it's done correctly, frugally. And the Census Bureau today is represented by Ron Jarmin. We're glad to have you with us. He's the acting director. And from the Government Accountability Office, we have Robert Goldenkoff and David Powner. Thank you very much for the work that you do on behalf of the taxpayers. And we welcome you to today's hearing and reiterate the importance of the job that you're doing. We're having this oversight hearing to ensure that our constituents' very scarce, precious, and hard-earned tax dollars are wisely spent, that the charge given to us by Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution is fulfilled, that it goes off flawlessly, we hope, and accurately. We are required by the Constitution to conduct an actual enumeration of the population every 10 years, and ever since Thomas Jefferson ran the first census, we have met that goal. But we haven't always been within budget, and that's a source of real concern. Director Jarmin, we're entrusting you with our constituents' hard-earned tax dollars, and we are expecting you to be very frugal and careful in how they are spent. We have a big job ahead of us. Today, I hope you'll be able to convince the committee that the Census Bureau is working diligently to ensure an accurate enumeration that is on time and within budget. That's absolutely essential. We've seen discouraging signs regarding cost, which are really distressing. Last May, your predecessor came before this committee to report a $300 million cost overrun, and by October, this had ballooned into a $3 billion overrun, with the 2020 census estimated now to cost $15.6 billion. The overruns have just got to stop. We just can't function this way. And it's got to be done correctly. The Commerce Department then asked the committee for a bailout. And we just simply cannot repeat that episode under either yours or Secretary Ross's watch. I know that he is personally overseeing the operation of the census. I know there's a lot of very capable career people that work under your direction. But this has just got to be done correctly, accurately, completely, and frugally, and within budget, and no more cost overruns. Aside from cost, another major concern is cyber security. With all the sensitive personal data that you have on Americans, the Census Bureau is a prime target for cyber criminals and hostile state actors. And like most Texans, I really treasure our privacy and am very wary of the federal government's overreach. When Americans give sensitive data to the federal government, we need to be confident that you can keep it safe. It's a really important question, and as David, you and I visited about earlier, the fact that the IRS had a website crash yesterday is of real concern. I know that part of your oversight includes the IRS, so I want to be sure we talk about that today, about what happened with the IRS, if you, whatever you can tell us, and then to be absolutely certain that the census is secure, safe, and we're not looking at any similar problems. One of the great things about this committee on appropriations is we all work arm in arm, and I'm really been pleased to have as our ranking member this year, Joe Serrano of New York, who we worked together for many, many years as good friends, and this is the best subcommittee on appropriations. And delighted to have you back, my friend, to join us, and happy to recognize you for any remarks you'd like to make.
My remarks, as you can imagine, will be a little longer than yours, but I've been doing that since we began. That's why he didn't hear me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to welcome the Acting Director of the Census Bureau, Dr. Ron Jarmin, as well as Robert Goldenkoff, Director of Strategic Issues, and David Powner, Director of Information Technology. I apologize if I've mispronounced your names, but we can get into a conversation about what I've been called throughout the years. No one rolls their R's anymore.
When New Yorkers can mangle language like Texans, we can really mangle.
I started by saying that my statement will be a little longer than yours, but you understand. The Census Bureau is now at a critical stage in preparations for the 2020 census. Final testing is underway in Providence. Staffing requirements are being finalized, leases are being decided, and rollout plans are happening now. Unfortunately, significant questions remain about the course of the 2020 census and this administration's commitment to ensuring an accurate count. Before I go further, I want to thank the chairman for working with our side and the Senate to greatly increase Census Bureau funding in the fiscal year 2018. The $2.8 billion included in that bill will help ensure the Bureau can ramp up critical preparations to allow the Decennial Census to get back on track and to replicate the successful partnership program of 2010. However, the Bureau's costs will continue to increase as we get closer to 2020, and I'm interested to hear how you're using the FY 2018 money and how your 2019 budget requirements are evolving. However, with this administration, it often seems like we go one step forward and 2 steps back. No sooner does this subcommittee attempt to rectify significant funding problems and in a bipartisan fashion support the efforts of the Census Bureau when we are forced to address another census crisis of the administration's own making. Of course, I'm referring to the recent addition of a citizenship question to the 2020 census form. The addition of a citizenship question to the decennial census without justification or testing is deeply troubling. It points to the politicization of what should be a nonpartisan effort, a problem underlined by reports that this question was added over the objections of career officials at the Bureau. The constitutional requirements to count all persons in our nation every 10 years allows the census to give us an important snapshot of how our communities are growing and changing. Unfortunately, with a citizenship question added to the form, many individuals will simply refuse to respond. I represent a large immigrant community in the Bronx that feels targeted by this administration. This latest action will undermine efforts to build trust and participation in the census in my hometown and elsewhere, which in turn will undermine census accuracy, but also distort the important functions that we use this information for, like the distribution of federal formula funds. Ironically, this will greatly harm not just blue states, but so-called red states too, like Texas, Arizona, and Florida. All of those states could lose congressional seats and electoral votes that they would otherwise gain in an accurate census. Aside from these important concerns, there's a significant literal cost to asking a citizenship question in the 2020 census. We know that Census Bureau experts and the Census Scientific Advisory Committee anticipate a lower initial response to the 2020 census because of the inclusion of this question. Additionally, we know that lower response rates translate into higher costs for an in-person follow-up visits. Add to that the lack of testing of this subject matter, and we here at the Appropriations Committee will be left to foot the bill, a larger bill than anticipated, without a clear understanding of what that will be. That is why, in part, why I hope to work with the chairman and others to prevent these problems from occurring by precluding the Census Bureau from moving forward with this wrong-headed proposal. I know we all share the goal of accurate and cost-effective decennial census. However, it is troubling that at this late stage, we still have serious questions about the administration's commitment to the same. And I'm looking forward to that discussion today. Before I end, Mr. Chairman, let me just say that at these committee hearings, we always try to keep the issues on the issues, if you will, and not get into personal feelings. But I personally feel offended that part of that citizenship question asks the following: were you born in the United States? And then you answer yes or no, or you skip it. That's what will happen with some people. Then it asks, were you born, and it lists all the territories, Puerto Rico, so on. Now, the census form doesn't ask, were you born in Texas? Were you born in California? Were you born in New York? But it does ask, were you born in a territory? If I fill it out correctly and not boycott that question, I will become part of a group of people that wrong-minded people, or people who hate, or people who are not in tune with what should be, will say, look, we have 10 million people who were born in a territory, or we have X amount of people who were not born. They will be seen as not being born fully Americans, when in fact I was born an American citizen in a territory. Which then begs the question that I've been asking for years. Why not include the territories in the total count? In other words, what is the population of the United States? Is it the 50 states and then the territories, which is what we do now? No, the full population is everybody who lives under the American flag, and that should be counted as one number. So you don't have X amount of Hispanics, you have X amount plus Puerto Rico, plus the Virgin Islands, plus other places. And so this question troubles me personally, and it offends me personally, because it sets me apart. I grew up in New York since the age of 8. I served in the military. I'm a member of Congress. I've been blessed, and I can't be prouder of being an American. And to single me out, or to single my community out by saying, were you born in a territory? The question asks itself, why are we asking these questions? What is it that we hope to gain, unless we're going to use it for something good? If you tell me, were you born in a territory, and then you include it in the total population of the U.S., we can discuss that. But if you're just going to allow people to single it out, that small percentage of Americans who still can't get used to the fact that we exist, or that Barack Obama was president, you know who I'm talking about, they will get to use this information in the wrong way. So I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, that I took extra time, but it's been a long time since a question or an issue bothered me personally more than this one. Thank you.
Mr. Toronto, absolutely understand, no problem, and we are glad to have you with us today to answer our questions. And Director Jarmin, you're recognized for your opening statement, which we would encourage you to summarize, and if there is no objection, we'll enter your statement in its entirety into the record. And I would ask each one of you to please keep your statements to 5 minutes, so we'll have additional time for questions. And you're recognized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, good morning, Chairman Culberson, Ranking Member Serrano, and members of the subcommittee. Before we begin, I want to express my appreciation for the Appropriations Bill passed by Congress 3 weeks ago. We are thankful not only for the financial resources, but also for the flexibility that allows us to commit the resources required for the census when they are needed. This year's appropriation helps to reduce overall risk to the 2020 census by enabling us to make critical investments beginning on October 1st. This appropriation and the way that it is structured underscores your commitment to the 2020 census and its success. Today, we are actively testing systems and operations in the 2018 end-to-end test. This is our final major test before the 2020 census. We are validating the interfaces between 44 critical systems and their integration with 24 major operations. As we speak today, we are in peak data collection operations in Providence County, Rhode Island. And just a aside, we just spoke with a Boy Scout troop from Providence on the way in the door here this morning. And the scout leader's father works as an enumerator, so I thought that was an interesting, Providence is an ideal location choice for this because it presents many of the different situations and challenges that we'll face across the country in 2020, and its demographics mirror those of the nation. The self-response phase of the test began with a series of mailings that were sent to housing units last month. I monitor self-response daily, as do many others at the Bureau and the department. Notably, we're receiving a high number of responses via the internet, and the overall response rate is as anticipated. As of this morning, we're at 32.5%. All of the planned innovations for the 2020 census are coming together in the test, and the lessons learned will provide a firm foundation for success in 2020. We are looking closely at the data from the address canvassing operation to make sure that our blend of in-office and in-field address canvassing meets our standards. Our internet and telephone operations are being thoroughly tested, as is our paper data capture operation. And we are confirming our ability to make it easier for people to respond with a smartphone or a tablet. In a few short weeks, our field staff will begin collecting information with handheld devices, and we will leverage automation to manage their work efficiently. Finally, we will examine the use of administrative records to inform final determinations about our ability to improve the efficiency of the non-response follow-up operation with information that people have already provided to the government. During and after the test, we'll adjust our systems and operations based on what we've learned to make sure that both are ready for the 2020 census. As we enter peak operations for the test, 40 out of the 44 systems required for the test have been deployed. No system will be released without completing the necessary integration testings and security authorizations, and all 44 are on track to be fully integrated and deployed when they are needed to support test operations. The Census Bureau has been working closely with the Government Accountability Office to ensure that we have consistent understanding of the status of systems readiness, and we are closely monitoring the final development and testing of the remaining systems. We are working intently to ensure that the systems are secure and they are authorized to operate. The ATO process is critical as it ensures that cybersecurity standards are addressed and risks are minimized for all of the systems. GAO is reviewing our progress to ensure that our processes and procedures are consistent with best practices, are well understood, and are followed. We value the independent assessment of GAO, and we are thankful for their continued engagement. We are also engaging with NIST, the Department of Homeland Security, other federal agencies, and with the private sector to address and reduce cybersecurity risk. We are working together to make sure that participating in the census is safe and secure, and that the information we collect is protected. Finally, we have a well-developed process for conducting the scalability tests on our systems during 2018, and we are eager to meet this critical milestone and fine-tune our systems to scale to predicted loads in 2020. All of our preparations are aimed at achieving our objective of a complete and accurate 2020 census. This means that we must also encourage people to respond. As in past decennial censuses, we will mount a robust communication and partnership program to encourage everyone to respond, including those who are traditionally hard to count. For 2020, we are compiling research and data that will serve as the foundation for a communications and partnership program that is stronger than in 2010. With the support of the recent appropriation, we are looking at accelerating communications activities and ramping up our partnership staff earlier than planned. Seasoned partnership specialists with many decades of experience have been working since January 27 to help tribal, state, and local governments develop complete count committees, which bring leaders and government officials together to develop plans to support the 2020 census. As we ramp up to 1,000 partnership specialists in FY19, our goal is to exceed the 248,000 community partners that we had in 2010. Census partners help everyone know that responding to the census is safe and important. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Director Jarmin. We look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Goldenkoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chairman Culberson, Ranking Member Serrano, and members of the subcommittee. GAO is pleased to be here today to discuss the Census Bureau's readiness for the 2020 headcount. As you know, in recent years, we have identified a number of operational, IT, and other challenges that raise serious concerns about the Bureau's ability to conduct a cost-effective enumeration, and in February 2017, we added the 2020 census to our list of high-risk government programs. My remarks today will focus on two such challenges: implementing design innovations aimed at controlling costs and developing reliable cost estimates that better account for risks and inform annual budget requests. My colleague, Dave Powner, will then discuss the challenges the Bureau faces in implementing and securing critical IT systems. The bottom line is that while the Bureau has made important progress toward mitigating some of the risks facing the census and we are encouraged by the top-level oversight being applied by the Department of Commerce, the census is now projected to cost $15.6 billion, a $3 billion increase over the Bureau's original estimate, and what's more, significant uncertainties lie ahead. For example, with respect to design innovations, to help control costs while maintaining accuracy, the Bureau will use new procedures and technology for 2020, including greater use of automated data collection methods, administrative records in place of data collected by enumerators, verifying addresses using aerial imagery and other in-office procedures rather than by going door to door, and allowing households the option of responding to the census via the internet. While all these new methods show promise for controlling costs, they also introduce new risks, in part because they have not been used to a great extent in prior decennials, if at all. So to help ensure that key systems and procedures will function as planned, since 2012, the Bureau has held a series of tests at various sites across the country. However, citing funding uncertainties, the Bureau has curtailed recent testing efforts. As one example, the Bureau is currently conducting, as was mentioned, the 2018 end-to-end test. Essentially, it's a dress rehearsal for the actual enumeration. And the 2018 test is critical because it is the Bureau's final opportunity to demonstrate that essential census-taking activities will perform under operational conditions. While the Bureau originally planned to conduct the 2018 test in 3 locations, 2 sites, areas of Washington State and West Virginia, were eliminated from a full test because of budgetary concerns, and a complete dress rehearsal will now only be held in Providence, Rhode Island. Without sufficient testing across a range of geographic locations, housing types, and demographic groups, operational problems can go undiscovered, and the opportunity to refine procedures and systems will be lost. Another risk factor is the Bureau's 2020 life cycle cost estimate. We found that the October 2015 version of its estimate fell short in our 4 best practices, only partially meeting the characteristics of comprehensiveness and accuracy, and minimally meeting characteristics for being well documented and credible. In December 2017, the Bureau provided us with the documentation used to update its cost estimate, and based on our preliminary analysis, we have found that the Bureau has improved its cost estimation process in each of those 4 best practices. So in short, while the Bureau and Department of Commerce have taken important steps to keep preparations for the decennial on track, a number of challenges and uncertainties remain. Going forward, continued leadership attention and congressional oversight will be needed to help ensure key components and systems are fully tested and will function as required, preparations stay on schedule, management functions follow leading practices, and any further cost growth is capped. This concludes my prepared remarks. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Dave Powner.
Thank you. Mr. Powner, you're recognized.
Chairman Culberson, Ranking Member Serrano, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting us to testify on the Bureau's efforts to deliver and secure technologies for the 2020 census. Since the last time we appeared before this subcommittee, the Bureau has announced a $3 billion increase to the overall cost of the decennial. About half of this increase, or $1.5 billion, is associated with IT. On a positive note, since Secretary Ross announced this cost increase, we have seen strengthened governance at both the Department of Commerce and at the Bureau. This includes the Bureau meeting monthly with Secretary Ross and weekly with the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. Although positive, we still see room for improvements to the executive level reports that go to Commerce on systems and security readiness. Your congressional oversight is essential to this transparency, and I would encourage Congress to request these status reports to ensure that progress continues and risks are mitigated. This morning, I will briefly summarize the status of systems development and testing, as well as security readiness. Starting with systems readiness. The Bureau has made progress, having completed development on 30 of the 44 systems. I'd like to note that number differs a little bit than what the 40 that was mentioned by Director Jarmin, and perhaps we could talk about that during the Q&A. Key systems that need to be completed are the operational control system, the enumeration application, and the fraud detection system. Despite delays, the Bureau has plans to have the operational control system and the enumeration application fully deployed by July so that it can be included as part of the end-to-end test. The fraud detection system has been delayed 8 months, It is not planned to be ready now until October of this year. Most of the systems that have been developed still need to undergo key integration testing to ensure that they interface or interact appropriately with other systems. My written statement shows that all but 8 of the 44 systems still need to undergo some sort of testing, and the 14 systems that must be delivered require significant testing, meaning that they must undergo systems as well as integration testing. Yeah, all but 8 of the systems need, so even though some systems are developed, there's still key integration testing that needs to occur. So what you do is you test them to make sure the system alone works, but the integration testing to make sure that they interact effectively is very important. And you want that done before it goes to the end-to-end test, so that you test as much of this as they operate as a unit of systems. Okay? It is important to note that once the end-to-end test is completed, there will be additional development and testing that needs to occur in 2019 to address new functionality, additional scaling and performance issues, as well as defects that are found during the end-to-end test. In addition to the 44 systems, the Bureau needs to ensure that key infrastructure is in place and secure. This includes cloud solutions, as well as the network and security operations. Regarding cybersecurity, the Bureau, like other agencies, is constantly under attack. Recent incidents involved unauthorized access, phishing, and malware. The Bureau is working diligently to assess security controls, fix known deficiencies, and to have the proper sign-off by both the Chief Information Officer and the head of the Decennial Office to ensure that each system is ready for operations. 6 of the 44 systems have this sign-off. 32 need to be reassessed given changes to the systems, and another 6 need to be completed, including the fraud detection system. These reviews are important to ensure that cyber risks are at acceptable levels, especially since 39 of the 44 systems contain personally identifiable information. We remain concerned that the late delivery of several systems will not leave ample time to complete the reviews and approvals. I'd like to conclude with 3 recommendations regarding IT for the Decennial. Number 1, executives at both the Department and Bureau need to stay engaged on the delivery and status of the systems and closely monitor the key risks. This includes the timely delivery of software to the technical integration for the integration testing that we just discussed, Mr. Chairman. Second, the Bureau needs to have rigorous oversight of its contractors, both during the end-to-end test and after, as we lead up to the Decennial. And third, they need to aggressively manage cybersecurity risks of the systems and the infrastructure, given the threats and vulnerabilities confronting the Bureau. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Powner. I'd like to start out asking you and Mr. Goldenkoff, what could be done, in your opinion, to improve accountability at the Census Bureau?
Well, you know, GAO, accountability is quite literally our middle name.
Right,
so
right.
Anything that can be done to improve accountability, we're all for it. You know, if you're talking about accountability of individual employees or more organizational performance?
Both.
Both? Okay.
Both, because in the private sector, clearly you'd be able to reward people for their good work with raise or promotion. People that, you know, have habitual problems, which is one of the great frustrations, I think, one of our great frustrations, I think, as taxpayers is the inability to fire people that
Sure.
don't do their job. And why wouldn't we give, for example, the secretary who comes out of the private sector, a very successful businessman, the ability to, frankly, hire and fire people that aren't performing in the Census Bureau?
Sure.
To increase accountability. Because ultimately, that's why the private sector obviously works so well. People know they're going to be rewarded for good work, and they could lose their job if they're not performing. And I tell you, the overruns are just appalling. I mean, it's just unacceptable. These $3 billion, and we just can't have this anymore. And I'm looking for some bold ideas.
Sure. First of all, you're absolutely right. If there is, if there are circumstances where there's been gross negligence and mismanagement, particularly at the top levels, we should be able to remove and terminate people who are not performing well.
That can't be done today, right?
Well, and I think this is not an issue with the Census Bureau. It's a government-wide issue.
It is. This is a great case study.
Exactly. And, we've looked at this just from a government-wide perspective. And, and this is, I said, we haven't looked at it for the Census Bureau. And so everything needs to be dealt with on a kind of a facts and circumstances basis. But at a, speaking at a higher level, there are things that agencies can do, and so short of termination, to hold particularly top executives accountable. One is making sure that you even have a good performance management system and it's used, and a lot of agencies don't have that. So what I mean by that is making sure that there's a line of sight between individual performance and organizational results, and that starts with your senior leaders. I would take a look at their performance contracts, their SES contracts, and see what are they being held accountable for.
And I appreciate that. I know David, Mr. Powner was talking about a moment ago that the important was he recommended that the executives at Commerce monitor, there be good oversight, that you're watching for, cyber intrusions. I'd just like you to think, both of you, outside the box for a minute. What would you recommend to this committee if we really wanted to be bold and ensure that the census does not engage, there's no more overruns, that things run efficiently? If you really wanted to make some bold, out-of-the-box recommendations to the committee about using, again, this is a great case study, and we know there's a lot of, Mr. Jarmin, you've got a lot of superb, top-notch professional people there who are committed to do their job, but this is a constant source of frustration throughout the entire federal government. I'd like you to think outside the box for a minute. What about creating some system where the secretary could absolutely decide that somebody needs to be fired in order to make sure that people are held accountable and we don't see any cost overruns, that this works as it should? People know there's consequences if they, and rewards for doing a good job.
So a couple things. I mean, that's probably a longer-term solution to get that
It may be sooner
addressed,
than
right?
you think.
One of the things I will say to the credit of the Bureau is they moved some individuals in terms of who's in charge and who's driving the ship, because I think we have a $3 billion overrun. You say, well, what's going to change? You have improved governance from Secretary Ross, but are the same players still? And there's been changes. So they did move some of the parts and everything. I think the thing that would really help, that this committee could really help, is there's nothing that drives performance like having an executive or Congress breathing down your neck. Okay, and that's why I think the Undersecretary and Secretary Ross having governance, as well as
Right.
Director Jarmin, that drives performance. If there's accurate status reports that go up on the delivery of systems, security of systems, the operations performing, where it's, let's say, at least quarterly from Congress.
Right.
If there was a quarterly status report came here, that you could actually look at the progress that's being done and whether the progress is according to the plan. So for instance, like in our report, in the appendix, we have 44 systems, and we say 19 of them were delayed. Okay, so we get into this back and forth with the Census Bureau. Well, it's not delayed because they claim that the operations were pushed back as part of the test. That's semantics. Okay, if it's supposed to be done here and it's not done here, what are we doing to mitigate risks and ensure that it's successful? I don't really care what word we use, but we need to make sure that this gets integrated, tested, and secured in time. And I think your oversight, back to my opening paragraph in my oral statement, I think if you got those status reports, at least on a quarterly basis, and dog the hell out of progress to ensure that they stay on schedule, that would be helpful, along with what's being done with Director Jarmin and also at the Department of Commerce.
I like that a lot. Relentlessly bird dog this. Secretary Ross, I know, is personally involved. This subcommittee will be personally involved. I know Mr. Serrano and I, Ms. Lowy, Chairman Flinghuysen, will all be working together to ensure that we just can't have any more of these $3 billion cost overruns. It's just unacceptable. And this end-to-end census test began last month, but according to GAO's testimony, close to a third of the IT systems required for the test are still being developed. I mean, we've known about this test for years, and I don't understand why all the IT systems aren't ready for tests. What's up with that?
So, they asked me to pull it closer, but I can't, so I'll lean forward. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the systems that Mr. Powner is referring to are actually being used right now. So we have a phased approach to, there are different product releases and certain functionalities ready for when it's needed. And the systems have been reviewed by the director of the Decennial Census and the CIO to ensure that all the public-facing systems have been ATO'd and that they're as secure as possible. We often have findings, and we do work on those to make sure that we have all of the documentation and, that we've checked all the boxes on that.
But why, for example, isn't the fraud detection system ready in time?
So the fraud detection system is actually something that we plan to use post-data collection, and we didn't need it for while we were in the field for the end-to-end test. It's something that we can test later. So that was a resource issue. We decided to focus resources on the things that we needed to get up and running for the test.
But one of the ones that you've got to get done is security system testing. What about the security testing for the systems?
So that's ongoing all the time, and will remain ongoing until we're done with the census. And so we're constantly working on improving the systems, testing the systems, and making sure that they're secure. So that will be an ongoing effort for.
You know, are you, Director Jarmin, confident we're not going to see any more increases in the cost of the census in fiscal year 2018? How confident are you that we're not going to see any more increases?
So as Mr. Goldenkoff noted, that, you know, we worked closely with the Secretary and his team at Commerce last year to do a very deep dive into the prior census, life cycle cost estimate. We brought in a team of folks that have been working on cost estimates for satellites at the department. So we had the best people available to work on that. We did a very deep dive and a very thorough review of the program, and I think we are confident that the $15.6 billion will cover the cost of the census.
So that's
But-
it.
So, we will be monitoring what happens in the test. I think there's sufficient contingency in there that even most kinds of fixes that we anticipate should be covered within the 15.6. But if there is something that we need to come talk to you, you'll hear from us right away.
And I assure you we'll be aggressively and rigorously conducting oversight of the way that you're proceeding. And obviously, we want to see people that do a good job rewarded, but those that are not, I mean, this subcommittee, we just can't tolerate any more of these cost overruns. And there's a whole I will use as needed to ensure that you stay within those cost boundaries. I'll do whatever I can to help Secretary Ross hold people accountable, reward those that do a good job, and hold other people accountable. I'm confident that with his background in the private sector, he could, he would do,
Yeah.
we gave him the tools that he had in the private sector. I'm confident Secretary Ross would really be able to ride herd on the census and ensure that our tax dollars are not wasted, and that the count would be accurate and complete and timely and secure. The private sector just doesn't have any problem with these things. It's maddening to us as taxpayers to see that the ease with which you can, whether it be ordering something online, transferring money in an account, you can be in any state, any country, and move money easily and securely. And to see these problems with the federal government is just it's maddening. And that's why I encourage the Government Accountability Office to think outside the box. Bring us some bold new suggestions on what you think we could do to help give Secretary Ross the tools he needs to really hold people accountable, to encourage that, to make sure that the census is accurate, complete, timely, secure.
Of sort of personnel changes over the last several months that I think are aimed at accomplishing just that. So we have some very good people on the team experienced with issues we've had in prior censuses that are able to sort of aggressively manage the schedule and the cost of the census.
Thank you, because this has to be done right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I understand Ms. Loy is on a tight schedule, so Mr. Serrano, with your gracious understanding and agreement, Ms. Loy, I'm pleased to recognize you because I know your schedule's short today.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my ranking member and friend. I know what a passionate advocate my friend, Mr. Serrano from New York, has been for an accurate census count. So thank you for giving me an opportunity. Unfortunately, there are all kinds of conflicts going on, so I appreciate it. I have just a question I'd like to ask. I strongly oppose this administration's decision to include a citizenship question on the 2020 census. A bipartisan group of 6 former directors of the Census Bureau wrote to Secretary Ross in January, urging him not to include this language. They wrote, and I quote, "We strongly believe that adding an untested question on citizenship status at this late point in the decennial planning process would put the accuracy of the enumeration and success of the census in all communities at grave risk. Can you tell me, why does the Trump administration think it knows better than the bipartisan group of 6 former census directors?
So thanks for that question. So as you know, so Title 13 of the U.S. Code delegates the responsibility for deciding which questions are on the census to the Secretary of Commerce. And when the request from the Department of Justice came in December, he directed a sort of a 3-prong review, a legal, a policy, and a technical review. The Census Bureau was responsible for the technical review. And as part of that review, I think the census folks, and as well as stakeholders outside, like the 6 former directors, noted that one of the main concerns that people have with a citizenship question is that there could be reduced response rates, especially in certain communities, like the Hispanic community and the immigrant communities. So there's not a lot of direct evidence that happens. So what can we look at to make that assessment? So the citizenship question has been on the American Community Survey since 2005, and it had been on the long form of the census since 1970. And so there's some, we can get some circumstantial evidence of what the differential response rates are, but it's not a large difference, and it's hard to pinpoint it to the citizenship question. So the Census Bureau provided 3 options to the Secretary. One was to do nothing, to continue to provide the citizen voting age population data from the American Community Survey, as we have done. One was to put the question on the census, and the other was to use administrative records, primarily from the Social Security Administration, but also from CIS and from the State Department, which is, those are in negotiation. The Census Bureau suggested that we thought that the best approach there would be to use administrative records, but we noted that there were strengths and weaknesses in terms of providing high-quality block-level citizen voting age population data to meet the request that the DOJ had stated in their letter. The Secretary reviewed that and opted, with all the other inputs that he had, including from the 6 former directors, opted for a sort of a hybrid approach of using, both using the administrative records and the question on the 2020 questionnaire. So that's how the Secretary made that assessment.
I understand that. And I just want to be sure my facts are the same. In Secretary Ross's March 26 memo, he points out that prior decennial censuses asked citizenship questions up until 1950. And Census Bureau surveys of sample populations continue to ask citizenship questions to this day. The Secretary also asserted that the citizenship question has been well tested. But we don't really know what Secretary Ross means by this, and I am highly skeptical that this administration has thoroughly tested this question to see if it would allow for an accurate count. So I want to follow up, Dr. Jarmin. Given the significance of the 2020 census and how important it is that we count everyone accurately, can you review again for me what data or information did the census rely on to come up with this proposal? And given the fact that a citizenship question has simply not been well tested or asked widely in nearly 70 years, 70 years, it seems to me the Census Bureau must treat this matter very carefully and should only proceed if there are credible assurances that it will do no harm. Can you tell me what assurances can we expect to receive, if any?
So as you know, we are under litigation on this, so I can't comment in detail. I can summarize what was already in the Secretary's decision memo, which I did pretty thoroughly. So I think, the question is being asked today. There are folks getting the American Community Survey. That question is on that form. That question has been answered by the population on the American Community Survey, and prior to that on the long form of the decennial census in 1970, 1980, 1990, and 2000. In 2005 is when we moved it to the American Community Survey. So it is the case that people understand and can answer the question. What we don't know, and where you're very perceptive, is that in the 2020 environment, where the data will be used for reapportionment and redistricting and the allocation of federal funds, we don't necessarily know how people will behave in that environment. There really is, unfortunately, no way to test that outside of doing it in the census. There is no other situation where the data are going to be used for those purposes, and so we can't say definitively what that would be. But there is some information that's being put together in an administrative record for these court cases, and when that becomes available, that's something that we will share with the subcommittee, and that you'll be able to review and understand the information that the Census Bureau reviewed and to provide to the Secretary.
Now, what is the time frame?
That, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you the answer to that question. So soon, I hope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you. Just a comment before I ask my questions. There are some people who may react to this and apply pressure on themselves by not answering the question. And therefore, there's even some groups who I don't support asking for a boycott of the census. And what I've told them is that we work too hard, all of us, to get people in certain communities, especially in the minority community, to fill out the census form, for it now to go back. And this is being transmitted to the world, so I'm going to get a lot of comments about, you should be part of the boycott. Well, I don't believe in the boycott because we work too hard to get people to believe in the census. On the other hand, if the census brings fear or pressure that this is going to take another route and misinformation goes out there, it begs the question, why would you ask it this time other than the way you've been asking it on the long form, which has not caused much problems, if any. So that's, keep harping on that, but it has to be. Mr. Jarmin, it has been, Director Jarmin, it has been reported that Secretary Ross made the decision to add a question on citizenship to the 2020 census over objections from senior career officials at the Census Bureau. Without putting you on a spot, is this true, and how heavily involved was the Census Bureau in this decision-making? So
we were involved in the technical review that the Secretary had asked for. Again, we made the recommendation of using administrative records, but we noted there was some strengths and weaknesses to that approach. There were some strengths and weaknesses to putting a question on the questionnaire, and there are some strengths and weaknesses associated with not doing anything at all. After that, it was up to the Secretary to use that information with other information that he gleaned from talking with legal staff and with talking to, for instance, the 6 former directors, a number of other stakeholders from across the country, sort of on both sides of this question. And he made that decision. The Census Bureau is an apolitical professional organization, and we will do our best to do a safe and secure and complete and accurate census that we are directed to do so by the department and by the Congress. So I do want to emphasize, though, that nothing has changed in terms of the security and sort of the culture that the Census Bureau brings to the table in terms of providing, making sure that the data are kept confidential. The census will remain to be safe and secure. We will not share statistical information with other government agencies. This will not go to law enforcement. So we work hard also to make sure that everybody feels like participating in the census is an important part of their civic duty. And so, we will continue to do so, whether the question is on the form or not.
Well, I just want you to remember something, and I don't expect you, nor will I ask you to comment on this unless you want to. So I don't want to bring you into waters you shouldn't be in. But it's clear to everybody that there is tension in this country between some minority groups and other people and the Justice Department and some of their comments and some of their views and how they handle certain things. So if you're worried about that, and then you read or you hear that the Justice Department is asking the Department of Commerce, i.e. the Census Bureau, to put this question in, your immediate reaction is, this can't be good. Finding out whether I'm a citizen or not, it's not a problem. But why are they asking this question? And the belief on the street, if you will, and we get to hear the people on the street, is that it's done to keep people from signing up and not being counted, and that helps in redistricting and so on. Who knows? But when fears start to grow, they're very hard to stop. Just like I told you before, when you ask me where I was born, and you don't ask Mr. Kilmer, and I'm not picking on him, where he was born, you're actually drawing a line between us. You're saying that I'm a citizen, but different than he, because I had to put down where I was born, and he did not. And that creates all kinds of mind games that we've been dealing with for a lot of years. We've made a lot of progress in this country, but we still have a lot of things to do. Mr. Jarmin, as you know, numerous members of Congress, including myself, have expressed serious concerns about the impact of the citizenship question. Dr. Jarmin, what is the latest point at which content changes could be made to the 2020 census questions without causing disruption to ensure that printed forms and information technology systems are still ready in time for Census Day? In other words, if my amendment, and I will have an amendment, wins, and then you guys will hate me because you'll have to change the forms. What is the time?
So thank you for the question, ranking member. But so let me tell you, we will never hate you, regardless of. So I used to work with his brother. So
my brother did 30 years, right, with
Yeah.
the Census Bureau, and I want you to know, that, Mr. Chairman, for the record, and for any report in the room, that he got that job before I came to Congress.
So in our plans, I think we would like to have everything settled for the questionnaire this fall.
This
Obviously,
fall?
yeah, that's in our plans. That reflects our inherent conservatism.
Putting a lot
on
of
these
pressure on the
matters.
chairman, to
So-
accept my amendment.
But there's time after that. If it extends beyond, say, next spring, early summer, I mean, you're getting into where changes are gonna cost money. So obviously, the Census Bureau would like this resolved very quickly.
Can I ask one more and then turn it over? Secretary Ross's memo asserts that, quote, no one provided evidence that there are residents who would respond accurately to a decennial census that did not contain a citizenship question, but would not respond if it did. However, at the very end of the Secretary's memo, he announces, quote, to minimize any impact on the decennial census response rates, I'm directing the Census Bureau to place the citizenship question last on the decennial census form. Doesn't this suggest that the department knows that there will be a very real and negative impact associated with adding this question? If so, why isn't the department testing the question as part of the 2018 end-to-end tests currently being conducted in Rhode Island?
So, thank you. So I think there's two parts to that question. One was, you know, whether or not there was, you know, about the response rate. And so I think, you know, both the Census Bureau and other external folks highlighted that was a concern to the Secretary. I think he recognizes that concern. There was not a lot of direct evidence to say that, you know, it would be X% of a increase in non-response. So he made a cost-benefit decision, you know, using several criteria. So I think that's, you know, that's how he came to that conclusion. In terms of putting the question last, I think that is a mitigation thing, you know, to make sure that if someone's going through the questionnaire and if they are put off by that question, that they complete as much of the questionnaire before that as possible. We are also doing other things to mitigate possible negative impacts of the question. So we have right now a survey out in the field called the Census Barriers and Attitudes and Motivators Survey. That's a survey to 50,000 people to ask their basic, you know, their likelihood to participate in the census and what makes them more likely to participate or not to participate. Associated with that, we have focus groups from around the country. Enrique Lamas is heading to Puerto Rico this afternoon to participate in some of those.
There's a game there tonight between the Indians and the Twins.
Yeah.
Okay. Good answer.
So if we see him on, you know, Twitter or something at a baseball game. But so we've instructed the folks that are sort of moderating those focus groups to add an inquiry about people's attitudes about the citizenship question. So we'll use this data to work with our advertising and our partnership specialists to try to come up with strategies to do, just like you said, to make people understand that participating in the census is important, that it's safe and secure, and that we need everybody to participate.
One closing comment on my comment about, you know, the territories being counted differently. And again, for any reporter listening to me, this is not a statement against non-citizens. But here's the truth. If you're living in New York and you are here legally, you'll be counted in the census as part of the population of the United States. If you're living in Puerto Rico and you are therefore a citizen, you won't be counted in the population of the United States. Something's wrong with that picture, and I don't think when they wrote the Constitution, they necessarily closed the door on what interpretations we can give it. I know they don't like me to say it's a moving document or evolving document, but it has been. And I would hope that the census continues to study the issue of can you or will you include the territories in the total population of the United States? Because we're cheating ourselves as a country. We actually have more people than we claim we have.
So I'm sure there's a lawyer who has an opinion on that, but we'll definitely take that back and
I have
have
an
some
opinion on
conversations. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
We need to remember those people are part of the United States, and also the extra territorial, I mean, the exclusive economic zone. The United States is about, land-wise, 50% larger than we actually realize because of the territories and all the underwater exclusive economic zone that we have as a result. Mr. Kilmer, I want to thank you all for your patience. I think it's important we let everybody have a chance to ask questions, so I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for being with us. I want to echo the concerns of the ranking member. You know, I think there's real concerns that the inclusion of this citizenship question can add uncertainty and risk and cost. You know, folks in my region know all too well the history of politicizing the census. It's history in World War II as a tool to discriminate against and intimidate Japanese Americans. I've heard from, we just did around town hall meetings in my district, and we heard from constituents who still remember that very well. and worry that the citizenship questions harkens back to that. Not to mention the risk just from a science standpoint. The data needs to be accurate so that Congress can make informed decisions about where money goes. So I guess I'd like to ask you, we've heard multiple experts who have suggested that this could impact response rates and the accuracy of the data. So has there been an estimate of what the non-response rate might be with and without the citizenship question, and what the range of potential increases in non-response might be due to the inclusion of that question?
So thanks for the question, Representative Kilmer. So, and good to see someone from my home state of Washington here. So I think, again, this is where the litigation probably limits what we can say right now. I think some of the numbers you've asked for are in some documents that were provided to the Secretary. If they become part of the administrative record and are made public, we'll be glad to get those to you. And then to have any conversations you might want to have to follow up from that. So again, I can say that, from me being an economist and, running regressions and trying to understand, causal impacts of things, that there's not a clean analysis that we can do to really determine, if differential response rates were due to the citizenship question or due to some other factor. So it's.
You haven't seen that evidence in previous censuses.
So, well, in the previous censuses, it was only long form, so that's one of the reasons why it's hard to tell what it would look like in this environment. So it's, I think we had some staff that made a good effort at this, but it's an imperfect, it's not going to be a definitive answer.
So a range was provided to the Secretary that suggested some impact on response rate?
Yes. Not a large impact, but some impact.
So what's the increase in cost for every increase in percent non-response?
So I think, if I recall, the last estimates that we saw were, in the $50 million range for percent non-response. But we're talking here because this would impact a relatively small part of the population that, it would be felt among subgroups, and so for the overall cost, it would not be particularly large.
Can you say a little bit more what you mean by that when you say I understand that there would be a differentiated non-response based on certain populations, but.
Right, so for many people, we don't expect that this would impact their response patterns at all. Citizens largely, and that's the majority of the population, and so it just wouldn't have a big impact on the overall response rate. It would be the response rates of subgroups that would matter.
So there's a range that was provided to the Secretary that suggests some percentage reduction, and it's about $50 million per 1%.
Yeah, but that's we don't expect a 1% reduction in
the
response.
aggregate.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. What are the risk mitigation steps that are being taken just in case there is an increase in non-response?
So that was some of the information I provided to the ranking member. So I think the current research that we're doing to be able to have a more explicit focus on the citizenship question. That'll be used with YNR, our advertising partner, to come up with strategies to message to the communities that we think might be impacted by this.
I see the red light of doom, so I will hold my other questions for if we're doing another round. I'm happy to stick around and ask.
Make sure I understood you to say you do not expect a 1% decline in participation.
Total, no.
No. So some significantly smaller amount, maybe even minimal. If any.
I think, I think let's wait till we can provide the information in a more robust way when the administrative record comes out, and then we would be really happy to come back and have a conversation with you about what we think the impacts would be. I think that's probably the best way to.
Fair to say the impact would be minimal?
I wouldn't say minimal. I would say it could be, in some communities, it might be important, but it's not.
Not going to reach 1%.
No.
Thank you. Recognize General from Alabama, Mr. Adder.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up. One of your first comments that you made, and in your written statement, you talk about in the midst of the 2018 end-to-end census test. And I will admit I have not spent a lot of time on researching how you develop this over time and get ready for the census. But from a 30,000-foot level, if you're going into a Rotary Club and speaking and you're asked about this 2018 end-to-end census, just to make a real summary of explain it from a 30,000-foot level exactly what this does.
So the 2018 end-to-end test is primarily meant to make sure that all of our systems and processes are ready for 2020. So it's roughly a dress rehearsal. We're not testing everything. There's a bunch of sort of post-data collection activities that we're not testing during the 2018 test. But it included an address canvassing portion that was last fall. That was done in West Virginia, Washington State, and in Providence.
3 areas that you mentioned.
And then we did peak operations in just Providence County, Rhode Island. That includes providing people the opportunity to respond on the internet, and that's what's been going on lately, to respond via the telephone, which we've also been getting a good number of phone calls, and via paper. And then in May, for the folks who haven't responded, just like we would in the actual census, we'll be sending enumerators out with smartphones to collect the data from those who haven't been counted yet. I was in Providence last week talking to a group there and sort of polled the folks to see if they'd been filling out their 2018 census test, and several of them actually had, so that was heartening. So we've got about 32.5% response rate right now.
So you'll have folks on the ground with smartphones that'll be taking a lot of this information. Will this be the first census in Pekin with the smartphones have been on the grounds, or was that last time? No. So.
Yes. And that is one of the key innovations, not just that they're using a smartphone, but that we're assigning their work sort of electronically, remotely. So in prior censuses where it was a paper-based operation, people would meet their crew leader in the morning, physically meet them and get their work assignments and go out and enumerate households, and then have to process that paper back. And, this is a much more efficient way. But like my colleagues from GAO, there is the added risk. We haven't done that before, so we're watching this, really carefully. I think we're in good shape so far. We'll see what happens in May.
How can you explain to me a little bit about how you work with states? Do you have is there a federal Census Bureau assigned to each particular state to make sure that particular state is ready to go, or how explain to me how that works?
So our outreach and partnership activities include what we call complete count committees. Many of those are done at the level of the governor, but they can be at any level. We have robust partnership program working with all levels of state and local government around the country, tribal governments as well. So I think we have a very sort of robust and diverse program of reaching out to all different parts of the community around the country to make sure that people can know that the census is safe and secure.
Do you have one particular person that's over each state?
I don't think we necessarily have one person over each state. We have multiple people in each state attacking different levels of the problem.
Okay. So what I was wondering is if you have, because obviously you hit on a little bit earlier, it depends on a lot about how much federal help and it's significant, and just to make sure that someone is looking after that particular state. Whereas one state may be, and I'm just throwing this out, Alabama may be very focused on it, whereas Georgia may, say this is important, but they're just not making a focus. I just wonder if there's somebody there that's saying, I'm watching this state.
So we have contact with all of the governor's offices in all 50 states and in the territories as well. So, we have a very robust, outreach.
But do you have one particular federal person that's assigned to that?
So we have, headquarters people who are in charge of the overall partnership program,
In other words, if I want to ask about how Alabama's doing on there, is there a person that it will be the person, the go-to person that say, I'm in charge of Alabama?
I can definitely get you someone who will get you the someone. I don't think we have someone who's in charge of Alabama, but we have people who are in charge of how.
Regions?
Yeah, so we have, both at headquarters and in the regional offices, people that are working with different levels of state and local government, and with private sector organizations and companies and churches and what have you. So it's a very, in 2010, we had 248,000 different partners. We expect to have close to 300,000 this time. And all of the major governmental organizations below the federal government will be represented in that.
Okay, I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. Ms. Bing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jarmin, do you believe that immigrant populations are harder to count?
So we have many groups are in hard to count populations, and immigrants are one of those subgroups, yes.
Do you believe that adding a last-minute question like the citizenship question will have a bigger impact on higher immigrant populations?
So this, harkens back to some of the conversations we had before. We do expect if there is a negative impact, it would be largely felt in various subgroups. Immigrant populations, Hispanic populations would be where we would expect to find that if we did find it. So.
If you could clarify something you mentioned before about how this question will not affect most people, namely citizens.
So the citizens won't have the same negative reaction to the question that we might expect non-citizens to have. But again, there's not a lot of evidence in what we do right now in the American Community Survey that says that impact is very large. So.
But you are acknowledging some sort of potential impact on response rates from people who might not be citizens or larger immigrant communities.
There could be some, yes.
I think that's reason enough to fear an inaccurate count, which is the main and sole purpose of the census as required by the Constitution. If you could also clarify something else that you said in your answer before about if someone wasn't comfortable filling out that citizenship question specifically on a census, that they would be able to not answer it?
So on all surveys, including the census, there's often item non-response, and so, we process many surveys with incomplete responses. The census is certainly one of those in the past. It will be in the future. If you don't fill out, we encourage people to fill out the questionnaire completely and fully. If you don't, there's some probability that we may need to follow up with you at a later date, either on the phone or in person. So obviously we want people to fill out the survey as completely as possible. But it is the case, just generically, that in the survey world, some people don't fill out whichever questionnaire they're being provided, whether it's a business survey, a household survey. There's often many questions that are left blank.
So if someone were to fill out the survey almost completely but not fill out the citizenship question, would their survey still be counted?
Yes.
Thank
But
you.
we would definitely encourage people to fill it out as completely as possible.
A couple other communities like diverse immigrant populations who we fear will be undercounted are rural Americans and children, particularly under the age of 5. Rural Americans are at a high risk for an undercount, as you know. Often homes are spread far apart, hidden from the main road, may not have city-style addresses. For the 2020 census, the Census Bureau has chosen to focus its efforts on electronic responses, which can also present challenges for rural communities where access to reliable internet is already an issue. What steps are you taking to ensure that these communities are properly counted?
So that's an excellent question. So in the 2018 end-to-end test in the address canvassing portion, We were in Beckley, West Virginia, which is a very limited internet access area, testing our systems and our equipment and our processes in that type of environment. We need to count everybody regardless of where they are. I think folks that are in a limited, we know from the American Community Survey which areas have limited internet access. We'll be sending those folks paper forms on the first mailing. Obviously, our goal is to hire our enumerators from local areas who know the area, know the people. We'll use many of the same methods that we used before to reach folks in rural areas. But again, partnership and outreach activities are critical here. But we will be using a range of response options. So areas with limited internet access should have plenty of opportunity to respond by phone or through paper.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jarmin, with respect to the census, in a September 2017 memo, Census staff noted unprecedented fears about confidentiality from respondents. Both respondents and field representatives expressed concerns at the very highest rates ever seen before during a pre-testing project, and you're familiar with that. Obviously, these concerns have strong implications for the accuracy of our census, and the question is, how concerned are you about that, about the fears about confidentiality, and what are you doing about it?
So thanks for that question. So I think, there is a general, unease in the public about how their data are used both by the government and by private organizations. The Census Bureau, the data that we collect from American households and businesses is covered by Title 13 of the U.S. Code. That means it has to be kept confidential, is used for statistical purposes only. So we will be, using our communications and outreach program to try to communicate to the public that participating in the census is safe and secure, and that their data will be used only for the purposes for which it was stated. I think that the trying to combat this problem is bigger than just the census. I think we're constantly. We know that when there's a data breach at a company, that people have issues sometimes responding to some of our surveys because it's fresh in their mind, and so it'll be important for us to get out and to really drive home the point that the census is safe and secure, and that regardless of what's happening in the community at the time, if there's a data breach, at another company or what have you, that they know that participating in the census is something that is important and is safe.
Can you reassure me that this is a very high priority for you, and it's not just, we're going to throw that in the outreach information?
Oh, no, absolutely. So, we work with our colleagues from GAO and from other government agencies to make sure that the systems that we collect and process the data on are secure, that the data are secure when they're moving and when they're at rest. So the protection of the data and the confidentiality of the responses are sort of part of the Census Bureau culture. It's something we take very seriously, that we know that we're not going to get the willing participation of American households and businesses for the surveys that we conduct if they know that the data are not safe. And so this is something that we take as one of the highest priorities of the agency.
And of course, one of the biggest fears you're going to be facing is that the information will be transferred to another government agency, and specifically ICE, for example. Are you envisioning specific reassurances that you're going to give the respondents about not sharing their data with other government agencies?
Yeah, we give those reassurances now, and we'll continue to do so.
All right. Also, the 2020 census is going to implement a number of innovations aimed at increasing efficiency and decreasing costs, and one of them is using internet responses. I know Chairman Culberson touched on this, but I want to follow up. An October 2017 GAO report titled 2020 Census, Continued Management Attention Needed to Oversee Innovations, Develop and Secure IT Systems, and improve cost estimation, found that the Census Bureau has not yet addressed several security risks and challenges to secure its systems and data, including making certain that security assessments are completed in a timely manner and that risks are at an acceptable level, unquote. According to the most recent GAO report as of this month, only 8 out of 44 IT systems have completed all testing for the 2018 end-to-end test. When will the remaining 36 IT systems be developed and tested for the 2018 end-to-end test, and why is this process taking so long?
So many of those systems are currently in use right now. They have authority to operate. There's still some additional functionality that we plan to add to some of them that will require additional testing and security assessments, and that's something that we'll be doing, until we go live with the census. So we'll be constantly, testing and improving the security of our systems until the census, and that includes sort of robust work with other government agencies and private sector organizations to be continually, sort of load testing, scalability testing, and security testing these systems. So,
is that a no problem answer?
No, it's not a no problem. It's a we are on this all the time answer.
Well, the most recent GAO report found, quote, the Bureau plans to rely heavily on both new and legacy IT systems and infrastructure, unquote. Considering 85% of these IT systems are going to be dealing with sensitive information from respondents, are you going to be able to test all the IT systems?
Yes, it is in the schedule. I think we are on track of completing all of that work. Again, this is something that we take very seriously. The security of these systems is tantamount, and we'll be on top of this all the way.
Well, I thank you, Dr. Jarmin, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Just double checking with the staff here, Mr. Cartwright, the law as a result of the concerns with the Japanese Americans in World War II Bureau from sharing individual data about individual Americans answering the survey with any other governmental entity. It's my staff tells me a felony.
Absolutely, it's 5 years in prison and $250,000 fine, and that law was passed in 1954, partly as a result of that regrettable incident in the World War II.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, it's one of our most sacred obligations to ensure that every American, all of us, every person is treated as equal protection and due process under the law, no matter who you are.
And that, I'll just say that this extends to, we use a lot of administrative data from other government agencies, from the IRS and Social Security Administration. The same protections are provided to all of the individually identifiable or company identifiable data that we get from. This is a part of how the Census Bureau operates, and so the culture of confidentiality is extremely strong at the Census Bureau.
It's a good thing. Yes, certainly.
This is something that's
You're
trouble.
Not on. Try it again. You good? Okay, go.
This is something that's troubled elected officials for a while. So when I go to a church, as I have been doing for a few years now, and saying, please sign the form, fill it out, no information, nobody is going to pass this on to anyone else, I was telling them the truth.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
It's important for people to know that. And I'm confident that the census form probably says that too. So when you're filling it out, it says
It does say that.
your information's private, it's not going to be shared.
Yeah.
No worries.
It also says your response is required by law.
Yeah. I don't want to be sure, because when we get to full committee, that we all understand that the testimony you've had here today is that you don't expect that the presence of this question is going to have a less than 1% impact, and probably far less than that.
So I think it's hard to predict what that would be. So, I mean, you know, I'm not in the business of
Plus it's confidential
predicting
anyway.
the future, but it is confidential, and I think this is something that we need to, you know, part of the way how we react, and, you know, people will follow what their leaders do, and I think this is something where if we assure people, regardless of what questions are on the form, that participating in the census is an absolutely essential thing to do,
Yeah.
then we will be in good shape.
And it's confidential. Texans like that.
Confidential.
We all like that as Americans. Like the government out of our lives, out of our business. It's a good thing. I'd like to ask the GAO, if I could, to talk to us a little bit about how accurate is the cost estimate, that the revised cost estimate that the census has given us? How reliable and accurate is that?
Sure. Thank you for that question. We have not looked at the actual number. What we have looked at was the process that the Census Bureau used to develop the cost estimate. And as you know, when we were here, we've testified on this before, and we've reported on it in the past, is that the Census Bureau did not follow our 4 best practices for a quality cost estimate. Those 4 best practices are: needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be well documented, it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be credible. What we found when we looked at the 2015 cost estimate is it fell short in each of those categories. It minimally met the categories of well documented and credible, and only partially met the categories of accurate and comprehensive. So, for example, some of the things that we were looking for and weren't there, not all costs were accounted for, not all risks were accounted for, we couldn't independently verify the calculations. And it was discouraging because we first brought issues with the Census Bureau's cost estimates to the Bureau's attention back in 2008. So this has been a long-standing problem.
10 years ago.
Yes. And the Census Bureau did make some changes there. I mean, one of the issues, one of our recommendations was to bring in more experts on cost estimation. The Census Bureau did that. It was still an issue with the 2015 estimate in terms of the quality of it. But then the Census Bureau updated its cost estimate. We reviewed the documentation for that beginning in December 2017. It's still a work in progress. Our review is still a work in progress. The good news is that the quality is much improved. So at least preliminarily, the Census Bureau now has substantially met the categories of accurate and credible, and fully met the categories of being comprehensive. Where the Census Bureau still fell short is in the area of being well documented.
And independently verifiable.
Yeah. So there have been improvements, and so to the Census Bureau's credit and the Department of Commerce's credit, we know that from the Secretary of Commerce all the way on down, the Census Bureau has really been focusing on this, and so now what we'll be looking for is additional documentation. Our report should be out later on, late spring, early summer. And what we'll be looking for going forward is the extent to which the Census Bureau manages off the cost estimate, that this is not just a one-time thing. They shouldn't be doing it just because GAO wants it, but it's something that you manage as conditions change, environmental conditions in the field. The circumstances, operational conditions are going to evolve over time, and that's going to affect costs.
Mr. Powner?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate a point, too, that Director Jarmin made. Your question earlier about whether the 15.6 is enough. There is a contingency in there, and hopefully it is enough, and the contingency covers it.
50 million.
15.6 billion.
Right, but I mean, I think
15.6 billion.
we've got a
Yeah.
contingency, you've asked for in the 2018 bill, a fund contingency of $50 million.
50 million, but that 15.6 has a larger contingency.
A much larger contingency in FY19 and FY20.
And so that's the question is, and we should know a lot more, to reiterate what Director Jarmin mentioned, at the end of near the end of the end-to-end test, how well the systems are performing, how well the security is, how well the operations are performing. We should have a pretty good indication by the end, this fall, for instance, whether there's going to be additional work and whether that contingency will cover the additional work that will remain.
Right, and we'll also know a lot of parameters that are in the life cycle cost estimate, we'll be able to get a more precise estimate of those, sort of buy down some risk there. So, I mean, we should know quite a bit more after the end of the test.
I hope you'll include in your report why, if you were told about these problems back in 2008, this hasn't been addressed. Really be interested in why this has been such a persistent problem in your opinion, and what creative solutions you'd recommend to the Congress to give the Secretary the authority that the Secretary needs to help resolve the problem. And in the area of cyber, you know, the Census Bureau is going to be a prime target for cyber attacks, and I see here that in 2016, the Australian census crashed when people tried to fill out their forms, and Australia has 5 fewer million people than Texas, and we just saw what happened with the IRS yesterday. Mr. Powner, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I know part of your responsibilities include monitoring the IRS. What can you tell us about what happened with the IRS website yesterday, and what steps are being taken to ensure that we don't have a crash like this from happening with the Census website?
Yeah, so regarding the IRS, there's still some unknowns there. It appears that what happened with the IRS, it was the front-end system, the modernized e-file system, not the back-end system, which everyone looks at the individual master file. That's the 50-year-old system where our tax returns are processed. There's unknown questions there about what really happened. They reported it was a hardware issue. Obviously, there's heavy traffic at this point in time, right, near tax day. IRS historically has done a really good job with performance and stress testing. So there's a question about was it a performance issue, was it a cyber incident, was it just a failure of the systems, and those are the questions that need to be asked, and we're going to sit down with their chief information officer real soon to find out exactly what happened. We'll report back to you. I think the important thing here is, as it pertains to the census and what happened with the Australian census, that was a denial of service attack. When you have a denial of service attack, I mean, clearly all these security issues that we're dealing with, the authority to operate, that Director Jarmin mentioned, it's very important that we have diligence in ensuring that the vulnerabilities are cleaned up and we have less holes in our systems. We're always somewhat vulnerable. The other thing that's really important here is the performance testing that needs to occur. You want to stress test the heck out of these things, because if everyone ends up hitting the internet response on certain dates or a certain time frame that triggers that, and that could very well happen with advertising and the like, you want to make sure that the system can handle that, irregardless of a denial of service. But what denial of service really does, what happened in Australia is they planted, you know, certain malware, and it populated itself throughout a network, and it overloaded the system, and then you couldn't access it for 2 days. So again, we got security and performance testing that's really important, and they're working on it hard, and they take this very serious.
You're satisfied with the level of testing and that's being done?
Well, their approach is rigorous and it follows best practice. I think what happens is there's a lot of work that still remains for additional testing. The changes to the systems that remain and the reassessing from a security point of view, that's what's important. Many of these have already been assessed once, but what you don't want is you don't want to change to a system that creates a vulnerability and you're only as good as your weakest link. So those reassessments are very important. And again, I think the Bureau takes this very serious. It's also important to look at what they're going to do from a penetration testing point of view. We know they've penetration tested the system. We have some outstanding questions about what the results of the penetration tests are, what's planned in the future. Because what you want to do, just when you think you're secure, you ought to try to penetrate it as much as you can to make sure we're as secure as possible. And again, they're working on that.
Will the census be using any sort of an app for people to be able to log on and fill out the forms more quickly and easily?
So it'll basically just be an internet browser type. You know, the internet response is just a website that they can go to.
A website.
Yeah.
Because I know NASA, there are some other apps that have had problems with cybersecurity when they sent an app out there and they wound up getting hacked.
Yeah, and we'll be monitoring this. I mean, so, you know, part of what we're doing that Mr. Powner referred to, you know, so we're doing penetration testing. We've put out bug bounties where we've invited people to come in and beat up the systems. We're also looking to use what's called red teams, which is basically a much slower, longer-term approach to try to find vulnerabilities in the systems. I mean, we're basically, you know, we're going to leave no stone unturned in trying to make sure that the systems are as secure as possible, because we do expect to be a big target in 2020, and we need to be able to do that. An additional mitigation thing that we're using, sort of vis-a-vis the lessons learned from the Australian experience, is that we'll use a mailing strategy, you know, so people will get a postcard in the mail that says, or a letter in the mail that says, please go on the website and fill out your census, here's your housing unit ID. We'll sort of spread that out over a period of time so that people aren't getting those mailings all on the same day, and then everybody, you know, excited to go out and fill out the census, hitting the site all at once. So there's some things that we're trying to do to sort of, you know, take some lessons from our Australian counterparts.
Thank you. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to apologize for all the questions we've asked on one subject, but I think you came ready to answer those questions because you suspected that would be a question. Let me show you something. I told you before that I was personally upset, right? But some other people may be upset. This is the way it will appear, and I'll share it with my colleagues. It says, is this person a citizen of the United States? And the first option is yes, born in the United States. That should be the end of it. Then it says, the second option, yes, born in Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, or Northern Marianas. That makes it look to anyone like being born in one of these places makes you a citizen different than being born in the United States. That might have been true when you had territories that were not states yet, and they were not incorporated, that whole issue. But the world has changed. I mean, when we have a war, we send people from those territories, and they can't refuse to go. You know, and that's the line I always use, because that's a sign of who they are. This is really opens the door for people to just say they're not like us, they're different. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if I get an email after this saying, so how'd you get to be a member of Congress? Do you qualify? I say, I may not qualify, but I certainly qualify citizenship-wise. So pin this up somewhere and look at it and see if you get the same feelings I get. The Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations, which among other things advises the Census Bureau on issues affecting immigrant populations, did not request the addition of a question on citizenship. Is that correct? And that doesn't that also undermine the case for including the question?
So you said that they did not request the question?
Right.
Yeah, the request came from the Department of Justice.
Wow. And did they comment on it, do you know? Or did the Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations?
So we've not had a meeting of that group since the Secretary's decision, so.
I see. This is the scary part, you know, that I told you about before. The fact that it came from the Justice Department. And one has to wonder, why would the Justice Department want to know that? That's the climate we're living in, you know?
So their letter stated that it was for enforcement of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, you enforce the Voting Rights Act by making sure the sheriffs don't stop people on their way to vote like they did in Florida when President Obama was running for office. You do other things. I can give you a list of things you do. You don't stop people from voting on that day. You make it easy for them to vote. How finding out if a person's a citizen is going to protect the Voting Rights Act is beyond me, because, you know, let me tell you something I know about the undocumented. They're terrified of the way they live. They're not in your face telling you, I'm here and I'm undocumented. The last thing on their mind is to go register to vote and commit such a crime. That's the last thing on their mind. Would they like to vote? Yes, they're coming into a whole new place where there's democracy and freedoms for everyone. But trust me, this is not about the Voting Rights Act. And my problem is that I'm embarrassed to say I haven't figured out what it's about. Next question, did anyone at the Census Bureau or the Commerce Department meet with officials from the Department of Justice or any outside group regarding the original request to add a citizenship question? Did anyone from the White House contact the Census Bureau or Commerce Department about this request? If so, will you please provide the names of those individuals and groups that met with Commerce Department officials?
So I can't speak for Commerce Department officials. I can say for the Census Bureau that I do not believe that we met with anyone from DOJ or the White House about this question.
Well, if you didn't meet, you say you don't believe, so could there be someone else that met from
No,
the department?
I don't think so.
But you're pretty sure that no one met. The final 2018 Omnibus Appropriations Agreement directed the Census Bureau to ensure that its fiscal year 2018 partnership and communications activities in support of the census, the 2020 census, are conducted at a level of effort and staffing no less than that conducted during fiscal year 2008 in preparation for the 2010 census. Please explain for us the ways in which the Census Bureau is working to abide by this directive of the committee and ensure that the partnership and communications efforts are at least as strong this year as they were at this same point 10 years ago.
So thank you, Ranking Member. So I think, so first of all, we started the partnership program earlier this time. We have 40 partnership specialists, seasoned specialists in the field right now. We've had them since the beginning of 2017. We have a team at Census who's looking into both on the communication and the partnership program of using those appropriations to accelerate both our planning for the communications campaign, hopefully so that we can get some ad buys done earlier and save some money, but also to start ramping up the partnership program this year. In addition, the main thing that we're looking at is also accelerating our scalability testing of our system so that we can get out ahead of that a little bit and sort of buy down some risk. But again, we have a team working on that right now. We're in conversations with both the department and the OMB about how we plan to do that. Once we have those conversations, we'll be glad to come back and talk to you guys about what exactly we're going to do.
Thanks, Chairman. Hate to come back to this, but I heard you say in response to the chairman's question that you couldn't confirm that the impact on response rate would be less than 1%. But I kind of want to double click on this because I think it's important to acknowledge that even fractions of percent matter when it comes to the census. So I was messing around on your census website. Do you know what percentage of the U.S. population is the state of Vermont?
The state of Vermont,
Yeah.
less than 1%,
It's 0.2%. How about the state of North Dakota?
even less than that.
Yeah. You know, as far as I could tell, there's well over a dozen states that are less than 1% of the U.S. population. So if there was a question under consideration that would risk not counting the people of Vermont or the people of North Dakota, would the U.S. Census consider having that in the list of questions on the census?
So again, we want every resident in the country to fill out the census, regardless of what questions are on the form. So, and that's what we are going to strive our best to do. We know that, from past experience that we'll fall short of that. Then we'll have lots of people out knocking on doors to do it the more expensive way. But, that is the goal of the Census Bureau, to get a complete and accurate count.
Along those lines, so the district I represent is largely rural. We have a big city, Tacoma. We've got a Navy community, Bremerton. We've got but we've got a large sort of geographic swath that's rural. We have 11 federally recognized tribes, and as you know, and I think part of the reason we're having this broader conversation around response rate is that a lot of federal funding is distributed for things like schools and hospitals and roads and public works and other vital programs. It's also used for things like the new market tax credit and the Opportunity Zone program, which is part of the tax bill. So I'm hoping you can tell me how you plan to ensure that rural and tribal communities are accurately counted in the 2020 census.
So thanks for the question. So there's a couple ways. So first of all, we make sure that that they have all of the opportunities to respond to the census. And so, you know, it's not just the internet, so folks that have limited internet connectivity will have the opportunity to respond by phone or by paper. And many of those communities where we know that internet connectivity is low, we're going to send out paper forms earlier than we do in other areas. In very rural communities, we'll use other operations like update leave or update and enumerate, although I don't think we do that in Washington State. But, you know, and then, you know, obviously we work with tribal leaders, you know, partnership activities with local folks in both big cities and small towns and in rural areas. So we'll use a very, you know, sort of tried and true method that we've used in the past to get to rural communities, and that is, you know, just boots on the ground if needed, but also providing people with multiple modes to self-respond to the census.
Kind of along those lines, there's, you mentioned you're from Washington State, so Seattle's cooking economically. There's parts of the district I represent that are certainly feeling left behind by that growth. And you're seeing just dramatic change in the nature of our economy and the impacts to the workforce. Two questions in that regard. One, what efforts are the Census Bureau undertaking to measure adoption and impacts of technologies, whether it be AI to robotics and other things, and the potential geographic disparity and the costs and benefits of that? And then secondly, to that end, in the late 80s and early 90s, the census had a standalone survey called the Survey of Manufacturing Technology. I noticed that you no longer run that survey. Is that something the Census Bureau would consider taking up again, just to look at some of these differentiated impacts of economic change?
So thanks for asking about something on the econ side of census, which is where I came from.
I saw your PhD.
And I actually have a little bit to do with some of this. So this summer we'll be fielding the first ever American Business Survey, which is an attempt to collapse several other surveys. And there is going to be a question on there about the use of some of these nascent technologies, so machine learning, robotics, and stuff like that. That'll be asked of 850,000 firms around the country in multiple industries. So obviously we're concerned not just about manufacturing, but retail and warehousing and what have you. So that's going out this summer. There will be a similar question added to the annual survey of manufacturers next year. And we would be happy to come down and discuss whether something like the survey of manufacturing technology, I would urge that we would think more broadly that manufacturing is probably, it's a good place to look for the impact of these technologies. But it's not the only place we should be looking. And sort of finally, I think, you know, we had the opportunity last January to meet with the American Economic Association's Statistics Committee during a lunch at the annual meetings, and discuss some of these things. And I think one thing that we've got is some of those folks will be coming in and assisting us as, you know, sort of special sworn employees and using these new survey items to sort of link to some of the other data that we have and try to get, you know, to look at the impacts of these technologies on the workforce, on productivity growth, things that are sort of, you know, critical to know how these technologies are impacting the economy. So,
cool. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
One of the reasons I enjoy the subcommittee so much, and we all work together so well, is we have superb members who add great clarity to the subjects we're working on. And I really appreciate your questions, because none of us would want the state of Vermont to disappear. You know? Correct. None of us. And the reason I think we wanted to, I mentioned the 1% is I heard you say that you expected if there's any impact at all, it's going to be far less than 1%, is where that came from. None of us would want to see any diminishment at all of participation in the census, or anybody to be undercounted. We all want to make sure it's accurate. I think I understood the testimony you gave us is that you don't know of it. You haven't seen any direct evidence. You haven't seen any evidence that inclusion of this question in censuses in the past caused any reduction in participation.
This is a difficult thing to measure with the data that we have at hand. And so I think that And that's why I sort of hedge on my answer of, sort of, predicting the future is because.
Correct, but you have seen no evidence of it in the past.
Not large direct evidence, no, so.
That was the concern. And Ms. Ming is next, and then Mr. Cartwright, who is, Mr. Cartwright's a superb attorney, and he's good at these things too, as is Ms. Ming. So, Ms. Ming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious. I know we talked about the prohibition of sharing of individual information. To my knowledge, during the Japanese internment situation in our country, I believe that information was shared with block level data.
So I think that is correct, yes.
And not individual
There
data.
was also, I think, some limited sharing of some data that was individual level, but most of it was, the data that was shared with the Army, I believe, was at the block level.
That's how the government found some of these folks and went out and rounded them up, was through the census data?
From what I've read, they shared block level data, not individual data, as you mentioned, was prohibited since then. And just to acknowledge that there's a concern that something similar could happen again, that would further lead to fear and reason for people to be afraid of filling out that question or the form in general.
So, we do rigorous disclosure avoidance procedures on all the data that we release. And we do release, block group level data right now from the American Community Survey, which is pretty low level of geography. This is a constant tension between data users who want more accurate data at a more granular level, and trying to protect the confidentiality of individual households. And so, this is, I think this is a more general conversation, not just about the citizenship question, but a general conversation about what is the optimal amount of detail that would be released in statistical publications versus sort of the utility of that data. So.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that many communities, not just immigrants, but many communities want assurances and deserve assurances that something like that, which happened to American citizens, would not ever happen again. So thank you for that. My other question, wanted to ensure that the Census Bureau has a smooth transition between fiscal year 18 and 19. The fiscal year 18 omnibus provided half the funding that the Bureau needs in 19 for the decennial census, as you know, and wanted to get an idea of how the Bureau is planning to use these funds, what issues will the Bureau prioritize, and also the plan for communications, advertisements, and working with local partnership groups.
So one of the concerns that we'd been expressing all along is the threat of a continuing resolution at the beginning of fiscal 19 that would have slowed down our efforts on getting the communications program underway. And so a couple of things that we're prioritizing on this year with the omnibus appropriation is to start the planning earlier for some of those communications activities, so that when October 1st comes around, that we're hitting the ground running. We're also ramping up, accelerating the hiring of some of our partnership specialists so that we can get partnership activities underway around the country. And then we're also accelerating some of the scalability testing. So all of these things are things that we would have been doing anyway, but we want to move some of that into FY18 so that we can buy down some risk and get things started sooner, so that we can, hopefully save some money on the advertising budget and those sorts of things. So it's this is really important, and we appreciate what the subcommittee and Congress more generally has done for us with this appropriation. I think it's going to yield a lot of great benefits for us.
And we will have commitment from the Bureau that we will work with appropriate communications specialists, experts, and local partnership groups that will be most effective in reaching out to a lot of these communities that are hardest to reach.
Absolutely, that's the plan.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ming. And I want to reiterate, as the Census Bureau has testified earlier, the form itself, when people fill it out, will say Your data cannot and will not be shared with any other governmental entity. It's a felony for us to share your private information with anyone else, just to reassure people that they can answer the questions with confidence that their privacy will be protected and they're not going to be handed over to ICE or anybody else. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So obviously, most of the questions you've got here today, Dr. Jarmin, reflect our concerns that we don't waste our money, we don't waste American taxpayer money on an inaccurate census. And are people going to be undercounted because they're afraid to answer the questions? Are people going to be undercounted because they're hard to get to? Things like that. And I wanted to touch on that. Individuals living in rural areas are harder to get to, right? Originally, the Bureau planned to conduct end-to-end testing in tribal, rural, suburban, and urban areas and collect information from 700,000 homes, but due to underfunding of this dress rehearsal, end-to-end testing is only happening in Providence, Rhode Island. Am I correct in that?
That's correct.
And that's for about 200,000 homes instead of 700,000, right?
That's correct, but we did conduct address canvassing operations in all those areas, including remote rural areas in West Virginia and some in Washington State.
But not the end-to-end dress rehearsal testing. Okay, so what are the significant differences between suburban and urban Providence and the many rural and remote areas in the United States? What gaps in understanding of participation rates do you anticipate because you only tested in Providence?
I don't think we anticipate any, I mean, you know, a lot of the methods that we'll be using in rural areas are the same methods that we've used before. You know, I think there'll be multiple opportunities for people to self-respond with, if they can't use the internet, they can use the telephone or the paper form, which is the same as they used before. We'll have robust partnership and outreach activities in all those communities, especially in tribal areas. So I'm, you know, fairly confident that we'll be able to address those areas the same as we have in the past.
Well, I get it, that, you know, we did it this way before, but we want to get better at this as time goes on. In the last census, in the 2010 census, nearly 1 million children under the age of 5 in rural areas did not show up in the census. Unlike other age groups, the count of young children appears to be increasingly less accurate. You're the expert at this, Doctor. What are the factors that make young children harder to count, and what are the implications of undercounting them?
So this is a focus area for us in this census. So you know, the undersecretary, acting deputy secretary, this is her personal issue. I was at an event in Providence last week that focused on the undercount of young children and African-American, young African-American men. You know, I think there are a host of issues, so I'm actually not an expert on the undercount of young children, but I mean, I do follow the debate. There are a number of issues. I think often young children are in what are already hard to count households. So they're often in a situation where there's a single parent. They may be living in a complex living situation. So we will be working closely with our advertising folks and with local partnership and community organizations to try to make sure that we're reaching out to these folks where they are and sort of ensuring that they know that participating in the census is important, not only for the adults in the household, but for the children in the household.
We on this subcommittee are also very interested in making sure we have accurate cost estimates for the census, because it's so important to get an accurate census for allocating important government resources like Medicaid, Social Security, housing grants, things like that. You understand. I know the end-to-end test is underway in Providence right now. What information have you garnered from the ongoing test that may call into question the cost estimate from 2017? Is there going to be time to update the budget for the census after that Providence end-to-end test and before the 2020 census is already underway.
So, so we haven't reviewed all the data yet from the Providence test. I can say I don't think there's been any showstoppers that have us, sort of scratching our head thinking that things aren't working the way we expected them to. So that's a good thing. But we haven't completed the test yet, and we haven't reviewed all of the data. We will be updating the life cycle cost estimate with the 2020 budget submission, and we'll be using the information from the test to inform that update of the life cycle cost estimate.
Are you going to be able to have enough time to make those assessments before
I
2020?
believe so. Yes, that's the plan.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Ms. Serrano, any further questions? We'll submit those for the record. We'll submit any further questions we have for the record. I want to thank each and every one of you for your service to the country, your time and testimony here today. And oh, excuse me. Yes, sir. Yes, without objection. We're happy to submit those. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead. The hearing's adjourned. Thank you.